And welcome back to the Mahtab Aziz Celebrity Lawyer program on Revive FM 94.0. And we have with us Sal Bashir, our guest today, and we were going through the early career of Elvis Presley and the influences that actually made that sort of unique sound and music in those early 50s. So I mean, I suppose it's a positive thing, I suppose, that Elvis never actually sort of based himself on any sort of current performer at the time, and that's probably what roused a lot of interest from people.
I think with Elvis there was huge influence, as we mentioned, and that's been agreed, and Elvis has said it many times that he got his influences from black music, and he came from the ghetto, so when Elvis sang, he knew what he was singing about, and he felt the soul, the pain, and he got that across in his record-breaking voice. And he used to listen to a lot of country artists as well, and he used to listen to the singers at the gospel churches. And when Elvis was growing up himself, he'd listen to all types of music on the radio stations. So Elvis, I think, when he started to record from some studios, that came across in his recordings, because he could record anything. And that was indicative of his influences, as I just mentioned, from when he grew up. Before he stepped into some studios, he could sing rock, pop, gospel, jazz, rhythm and blues. He could sing country and western, hillbilly, rockabilly. He could sing all types of music, and with such conviction, again, that he not only produced some stellar vocal records, it almost as if that he came from that genre of music, but Elvis would always take off at a different tangent, and he was amazing. But that showed Elvis's influences when he grew up, the kind of artist that he did like. And in some of Elvis's records, it's very evident that he did like Dean Martin. And there's songs like For the Millionth and Last Time, and even Kiss Me Quick. They're very they're influenced by Dean Martin. You can see those little vocal gymnastics that Elvis did in those records, that they were influenced by people like Dean Martin, and who he met later on. He did admire him.
Right. Yes, because when apparently when he went to Sun Records, and it was Marion Kiska who in fact asked him, who do you sound like, and he said, I don't sound like nobody. so
exactly, that's what he said. He didn't sound like anybody. And people like Rufus Thomas and Ike Turner, who were recording at some studios, and they all immersed themselves into loving Elvis. There's a guy that Elvis did get influenced by, Roy Hamilton, and he sang a song called Any Day Now, and Elvis recorded this at the famous recordings that he made in 1969 in Memphis, and he actually met Roy Hamilton, and again another huge influence on Elvis when he was listening to the radio stations. But Elvis is quite correct. He don't sound like anybody, because it was very hard to pin down who he sounded like. But it was a sound so unique, and that's what sold so many records.
Right. And in fact, he wasn't disparaged by any of the negative comments. I mean, obviously, when you're sort of, as the Beatles found themselves, that when as you sort of in your early sort of formative years, there may well be people who think that you haven't got a chance, or give it up or something. And Elvis was not different. He had his disparages, but yet he carried on, and thankfully, went on to become the most successful, recording artist. But,
when Elvis was recording, he did get a lot of negative feedback, and as we mentioned, back in those days, he was heavily criticised, not just for the kind of music that he was singing, because the white people were saying, you're singing black music and we just don't do that, but also he was dancing around like them as well. And again, that was a different thing too, because he was dancing around and jigging about, and it was considered was considered suggestive at the time, and again associated with the kind of dancing that they associated with black people. But Elvis didn't feel that was suggestive, didn't feel that he was being vulgar or anything like that. He was just digging the music and, again, producing the goods on stage, showing the listener, the viewer, where his influence came from, and he enjoyed them, and he loved that music so much. And he's tamed by what they're doing these days. I can tell you that for a fact.
Yeah, that's right. And I believe it was a way for him to get rid of his sort of nervousness and stage fright, because I believe there was an occasion where he was invited onto a radio, and he just couldn't do it. On the first occasion, he just couldn't sing. He was sort of got this sort of stage fright, and he was only able to do it perhaps on the second occasion that he was invited in to sing on the radio.
Well, he knew that his song was going to be played on the radio station, so he disappeared off into the cinema, and I think it was Dewey Phillips, I think, no relation to Sam Phillips. He asked to get this kid in for an interview, and they found Elvis and got him into the radio station and spoke to him, and then Elvis turned around and said, well, when does the radio station interview start? And the and the presenter said, we've already just done it, we've just spoken about it, it was live. And I think Elvis felt physically sick, because had he known that he was speaking live on the radio, he probably wouldn't have been able to be so chatty, a bit like myself, really. Can't stop.
It's actually amazing that when you think that people like Elvis and also Freddie Mercury as well, they were actually they admitted being very shy personalities, yet when they get onto the stage, they transform into sort of a completely different individual.
Again, you have to quote Elvis. I mean, a hell of a lot of stuff's been written about Elvis, but if you listen to the interviews, the answer's already there. Elvis was quoted saying, he actually said, he goes, the image is one thing and the human being is another. And what you said about Freddie Mercury off stage, a very different type of personality than the outrageous performer that he was and other artists were on stage. They're completely different people on stage, because again, they can switch off, and an artist should switch off. They need to come back to what they are like in everyday life off stage. Be humble, keep their feet grounded, be appreciative of their success, but not be big-headed. Talk to people, make time for them, be there for them. And Elvis and people like Freddie Mercury were like that, very generous people, very likeable people off stage.
In fact, in a recent survey, people were asked, which is the one sort of person that you'd like to time travel to back. And Elvis and Freddie came out tops. They were the two people that most people would like to have traveled back in time and had a conversation with. So that's a very positive statistic that's just come out.
Well, 43 years after Elvis has passed away, it shows the magnitude of the influence that was left behind by Elvis and Freddie Mercury in the 90s when he sadly left us. And Freddie Mercury was a huge fan of Elvis himself. He recorded a couple of versions of, I think, Jailhouse Rock, and did it in these very flamboyant Freddie Mercury style, and did it real good justice. But he loved Elvis. It doesn't surprise me. People like Buddy Holly and Jimi Hendrix and the Janis Joplins of the world, Jim Morrison's, their influences are always going to be felt long after they're gone, because they were very special, talented human beings. And it doesn't surprise me that Elvis always comes out on top, because he's just the king of music as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, that's right. And his first sort of major break came through when, in fact, he performed under the headlining Slim Whitman, I believe. And that's
yes, he did perform on just like any artist. When you're a fledgling performer, you are, put in with other artists who are at that time more successful, so that you can get the exposure.
Yes. Yeah, and of course he went on from there, and it was Colonel Parker, in fact, who guided him to. He was at the time, he regarded as the most successful music promoter. So it was Colonel Parker that, in fact...
Colonel Parker was an entrepreneur, and as we've had many conversations, Mahtab, in private about Elvis, and one of the sticking points, or one of the savoury points can be made of Colonel Parker, but sticking with the positive here, Colonel Parker saw that Elvis had what he said, $1 million worth of talent, and that's exactly what happened. He got him that $1 million and many more afterwards, because he was an entrepreneur. He knew how to take something small and make it into a big profit, and that's what he did. And as a manager, you should be thinking like that on how you can develop a business and make it successful. But later on, as we know, it became to the detriment of Elvis, and that's a whole new subject.
That's right, and it was Colonel. Well, we call him Colonel Parker. He wasn't actually a military person. I believe that was an honorary title that was given to him by the governor of Louisiana, and he, in fact. He was the one that sort of convinced him to go into acting. And I mean, looking back, I mean, yes, as you say, certain decisions may, in retrospect, may not have been the best ones.
Well, again, you've got to go back to some of the quotations with Elvis. He actually said, this is how this business works, You do a live show, you make a record, and then you go and make a movie. That's what Frank Sinatra did. But unlike Frank Sinatra, who had an outstanding, successful career as a film star, the same could not have been said of Elvis, unfortunately, because, well, they didn't treat him in the same way as your Frank Sinatra's or even Dean Martin and people like that. It's very sad, because Elvis could have been a first-class actor. He would have been fantastic in films like Kelly's Heroes and The Bridge Over the River Kwai, and many other movies, but it wasn't to be. Elvis did make some very good movies, and we mustn't forget some of those absolute monster hits came from those movies. So I'm glad Elvis made the movies, but I just wish he'd made a few more of the same ilk as, say, King Creole and ones like that,
That's right, yes. King Creole, in fact, one of my favourites. I mean, he was certainly displayed a genuine, acting talent there. And it's a shame he didn't proceed to do more of that type of film. And also Flaming Star was one of my favourites as well. I mean, these were films that actually where he had a really good character to play, and he did it really well.
Yes, he played a half-breed Indian in Flaming Star, and clearly showed that he had good acting abilities. And the same year he made Wild in the Country as well, and that was another good movie. But they didn't make as much money as your films like Viva Las Vegas, which was the most successful film financially that Elvis had at the time, and films like Blue Hawaii. So we kind of went back to Elvis and said, look, these films are not making much money, and the film studios want you to make films that are involving loads of boats and cars and beach movies. So yes, Elvis became very disillusioned with Hollywood after a while, and quite rightly so.
That's right. And I think probably at the beginning, Colonel Parker probably realised that it didn't matter what Elvis did or what the plot was. People would still come to see him. But I think after a while, that sort of wore off. I think that's probably the reason why a lot of those films don't really have much of a plot or any sort of characterization to any degree.
But no plots whatsoever. Very, very sad. But I think as Elvis's fans grew up, they became very tired of the same formula of the movies, and they moved on to more substantial things, especially around 1967, 1968, and the Civil Rights Movement. The world had changed.
Yes, that's right. And of course he was interviewed quite a lot on TV, and his amazing sort of attraction came through very well. I mean, there was something sort of like the X factor about him that when he used to come to all these sort of TV shows, it was just straight away evident that this was a very special person.
Yes, and again, the black music was felt in abundance in 1968 when Elvis performed in that iconic suit, the black leather suit, and he sang songs like Up Above My Head and Where Could I Go But the Lord, and of course the best song that came from that TV special was If I Can Dream.
Yes.
And it was around about the same time as the civil rights movements, and when sadly Martin Luther King was assassinated in Elvis's hometown of Memphis, Tennessee. So that show brought back Elvis to the top of the pile, and he had many more hits thereafterwards, and a welcome return to live performances again.
Yes, that's right. And how important were the Ed Sullivan shows in for his career, do you think?
Enormous. Enormous. Elvis was doing really well around the southern states, but nobody knew him outside of those few southern states. So to give Elvis maximum exposure, he had to appear on television. And Ed Sullivan wasn't a great fan of Elvis before he met him. He certainly was afterwards, and found out about how humble and grounded Elvis was, and did end up liking him. But Ed Sullivan, was once quoted saying, "I will never have him on my show," because of all the jiggling and jumping around and what he classed as very suggestive dancing, and found him probably quite vulgar.
Yes.
But yes, he appeared in Milton Berle's show, and he gave him a very good glowing praise when he was on his shows, and the Dorsey shows as well. So it exposed Elvis nationally. Basically overnight, the USA went nuts over Elvis, and those TV shows were mainly responsible, and then the films followed.
Right. And in those formative years, I mean, as you suggested yourself, it was a very diverse, you had such a big talent, he could sing any type of song. And was there sort of, I mean, how did he sort of juggle with that? Because his ballads were absolutely amazing, and also, his rock and roll songs were up there as well. So I wonder how he decided to focus on perhaps the rock and roll or the ballads, or did he decide better to retain both of them? Because I know Bill Haley said to him to keep away from the ballads.
Well, I've not read whether Bill Haley said that or not, but clearly Elvis was his own man, and of course he was one of the finest producers in the studio. Elvis knew what he wanted. Of course, we spoke about he didn't have any musical education, but he knew what he wanted, and as a producer, it's very hard to find somebody who was better than Elvis in the studio. But yeah, you're absolutely correct. Here's a man who could sing the rasping, raw Hound Dog, and then later on produce that magnificent performance on American Trilogy. This is the same person and the same voice, but Elvis was able to adapt. Why? Because he felt the music, he felt the song, he felt the words, he felt the lyrics. So Elvis himself wouldn't say he was strictly a rock and roll singer or strictly a ballad singer. He would say if he could find a song and he liked it, he would do them. And you're quite right. If you listen to the high notes of Surrender and It's Now or Never, then you listen to things like Viva Las Vegas and Little Sister, Heartbreak Hotel. This is the same man. This is the same man, and it's also it's amazing that you are listening to the same man, because he's using a different vocal talent for each of those songs.
Yes.
And it's amazing, but you still know it's Elvis. Why? Because you feel it.
Well, that's why they call him the king, I suppose. But we're coming up to our second break, Sal. It's been absolutely fascinating. Please do stay with us, and we'll carry on after this break.
My pleasure.
Last part of the show. Thank you.